The food truck was parked on a busy corner in downtown New York, right in the middle of the lunchtime rush. Office workers, construction guys, and students lined up, each waiting for a chance to grab a hot plate of food. The smell of grilled onions, sizzling beef and fresh bread filled the air, mixing with the chatter of the crowd. Behind the counter, a 24-year-old girl worked quickly, her dark hair tucked under a faded cap, a simple t-shirt spotted with food stains, her hands moving fast. She looked tired but focused, barely lifting her eyes as she filled orders. At the very end of the line stood a 36-year-old man, tall and sharply dressed in a tailored navy suit that seemed out of place in the food truck line. He carried himself with quiet confidence, a watch on his wrist worth more than the truck itself. Yet he waited without complaint, scrolling his phone occasionally, though his attention drifted toward the girl behind the counter. His expression wasn't the usual impatience of a wealthy man unused to waiting. It was something different, something softer, as though he was studying her every move. The line moved forward quickly, and finally it was his turn. The girl didn't even glance up at him. She was too busy wiping sweat from her brow and sliding a paper plate of food across the counter. "Next," she called without hesitation, already reaching for another order slip. To her, he was just another hungry customer in a sea of faces, someone who would eat, leave, and probably never be remembered. She didn't see the recognition in his eyes, didn't notice how intently he looked at her, as though time itself had stopped. For him, though, it wasn't just another moment. The sight of her had pulled him back to years earlier, before the wealth, before the tailored suits, when life was different and uncertain. He remembered a cold evening in a rundown park, the wooden bench creaking, as he sat down beside a girl who looked just as lost as he felt. She had been 18 then, clutching a backpack and staring at the ground as though the world had given up on her. He remembered how she had offered him half of the sandwich she had, even though it seemed like all she had left. Now, standing here in front of her food truck, he could hardly believe it was the same girl. She looked different, older, worn by hard work and exhaustion, but her face was unforgettable. The way her brow furrowed as she concentrated, the curve of her lips as she muttered orders. Yes, it was her. He felt his chest tighten as the memories rushed back, and for a moment the noise of the city faded away. He wasn't a millionaire CEO in that moment. He was just the young man who had once sat beside her, grateful for her kindness. He picked up the plate of food she had slid across the counter. His hands lingered, not for the food, but for the courage to say something, to bridge the years that had passed between them. His voice came out softer than he intended, low enough that only she could hear. "Still remember me?" he asked, his words hanging in the air like a secret between them. The girl froze mid-motion, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for the next order slip. She blinked, stunned, as if the sound of his voice had unlocked a door she thought had long been shut. Slowly her eyes lifted, and for the first time that afternoon, their gazes met. She stared at him, searching his face, her heart racing as recognition began to flicker in her expression. Something about the curve of his jaw, the intensity in his eyes, it all felt familiar. Memories stirred, unsteady and fragile, as though she were piecing together a dream she thought she had forgotten. She didn't answer right away, but the way she looked at him was enough to confirm what he already knew. The girl from the park, the one who had once shared a meal with him when both of them had so little, now stood before him, handing out food to strangers. The girl's breath caught in her throat as the weight of his words settled in. Her hands, once steady from hours of repetition, now shook slightly, and she set down the order slip to steady herself. Her eyes stayed locked on his, a storm of confusion and recognition swirling together. She hadn't thought about that night in years, the night in the run-down park where a stranger had sat beside her and reminded her she wasn't invisible. Back then she'd been lost, broke, and barely holding on. Now that same stranger stood before her as someone entirely different. Her lips parted, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she leaned back slightly, studying him in disbelief. His suit was expensive, his demeanor polished, but beneath it all, she saw him. The boyish man with kind eyes who had once offered her warmth when she had none. "It's you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the food truck's grill. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to pause, to let the memory wash over her. The Millionaire CEO smiled faintly, his eyes soft, carrying none of the arrogance usually tied to wealth. "I never forgot you," he said quietly, his tone gentle and sincere. "That night, you shared what little you had. I was a stranger, but you still gave me half your food when you barely had enough for yourself. It meant more than you know." The noise of customers grew distant. It felt as if the world had shrunk to just the two of them. She blinked rapidly, her chest tightening. She had forgotten the small details of that night. But the feeling, loneliness, desperation, and the strange comfort of his presence came back vividly. The line of customers shuffled impatiently, breaking the silence between them. Someone coughed loudly, reminding her she had work to do. She shook her head slightly, forcing herself back into the present, back into her role behind the counter. "You've changed," she said, her voice steadier now. Her eyes darted toward his suit, the gleam of his watch. "You're not the same man I met back then." He chuckled softly, acknowledging the truth in her words. "I had nothing then," he admitted, "but I had your kindness. And maybe that's what kept me going." The girl swallowed hard, suddenly overwhelmed. The idea that something so small, a sandwich, a quiet conversation, could matter so much to someone else unsettled her. She had always brushed that night off as just another struggle in a long line of hardships. To him, though, it had been a turning point, a memory worth holding on to. She lowered her gaze, gripping the edge of the counter as if grounding herself. "I didn't think anyone would remember me," she confessed, her voice thick with emotion. He shook his head, his eyes firm. "Some people," he said softly, "you never forget." For a moment, they simply stood there, two lives pulled together again by fate, surrounded by the clatter of plates and the aroma of grilled food. She wanted to ask him everything, what happened after that night, how he became who he was now, why he had waited until today to reveal himself. But the words tangled inside her, too heavy to voice. He glanced at the growing line and stepped back slightly, not wanting to draw attention. "We'll talk," he promised, his voice low. "And when you're done here, if you'll let me." She nodded, almost instinctively, though her heart raced with uncertainty. As he stepped aside, she returned to work, her hands moving on autopilot while her thoughts spiraled. Every time she looked up, she caught sight of him standing nearby, waiting patiently, with the same quiet presence he'd shown years ago. And for the first time in a long while, she felt something shift inside her, a fragile hope that maybe the past wasn't as far away as she thought. And maybe, just maybe, it had led her here for a reason.